The dust settled around Jacob's boots as he watched the horizon turn crimson. 20 years he'd worked this land, carved a life from nothing but stubborn soil and stubborn will. The ranch stretched for miles in every direction, empty except for cattle and memories. His father had built the main house with his own hands before dying young, leaving Jacob alone at 16 to finish what was started. Now at 36, Jacob had everything a man could want except the one thing that mattered. He had land but no one to share it with. He had success but no warmth in his bed. The nights grew longer each year, and the silence grew heavier. Thunder rumbled overhead, strange for this time of year. Jacob squinted at the darkening sky, watching clouds spiral into impossible patterns. Lightning cracked without rain, purple and green instead of white. The cattle scattered toward the far pasture, spooked by something he couldn't see. Then the light came. It wasn't sunlight or moonlight or anything natural. It poured from the sky like liquid silver, pooling in his northern field where the old stone circle stood. His grandfather claimed those stones were ancient, placed by people who came before. Jacob had always dismissed it as superstition. He mounted his horse and rode toward the light, his heart hammering against his ribs. The closer he got, the stranger everything became. The air felt thick, electric, humming with energy that made his skin prickle. When he reached the stone circle, the light was fading, but something remained. Someone remained. She lay in the center of the stones, curled on her side like a sleeping child, except she was no child. Even collapsed on the ground, she was enormous. Her hand alone was the size of his torso. Her hair spread around her like spun gold, and her dress, if you could call it that, seemed woven from starlight itself. Jacob dismounted slowly, his mind racing through explanations that all fell short. She couldn't be real. She couldn't be here. But she was breathing, her chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep. He approached carefully, boots crunching on grass that had been burned silver by whatever brought her. Up close, her face took his breath away. She was beautiful beyond anything he'd ever seen, with features that seemed carved by an artist who understood perfection. But she was also clearly not from anywhere he knew. Her skin had a faint luminescence, and when he got close enough, he could see tiny markings along her arms like constellations mapped onto flesh. She stirred, and Jacob froze. Her eyes opened, revealing irises that swirled with colors that had no names. She looked at him, and in that moment, something passed between them that transcended words. Recognition. Not of faces but of souls. She spoke, and though the language was nothing he'd ever heard, he understood her meaning. She was lost. She was alone. She needed help. Jacob nodded, his throat too tight for words. She tried to sit up, swayed, and he instinctively reached out to steady her, his hands barely spanning her wrist. She was warm, solid, real. Whatever impossible thing had happened, she was here now, and every instinct he possessed told him she was meant to be. She looked around at the ranch, at the house in the distance, at the vast empty land that had been his prison and his kingdom. Then she looked back at him, and he saw his own loneliness reflected in her eyes. Whatever she was running from, wherever she came from, she was as alone as he was. The storm that had brought her began to fade, stars emerging in the clearing sky. Jacob made a decision that would change everything. He gestured toward his home, toward shelter and safety. She understood. She stood carefully, towering over him like a goddess from forgotten myths, and together they walked toward the house. Neither of them knew that this moment, this meeting, was the beginning of something that would shake the foundations of both their worlds. Getting her into the house proved impossible. The doorways were built for normal men, not beings who stood 15 feet tall. She tried to crouch, to fold herself small, but architecture didn't bend to will. Jacob stood in his living room, looking out at her through the window as she sat in his yard, and felt the absurdity of the situation crash over him. Here was this magnificent creature, this impossible woman, and he couldn't even offer her basic shelter. She hugged her knees to her chest, looking vulnerable despite her size, and something in Jacob's chest cracked open. He grabbed blankets, every quilt and cover he owned, and brought them outside. The night air had turned cold, autumn asserting itself now that the strange storm had passed. She watched him pile blankets around her with an expression that managed to be both grateful and heartbroken. He wanted to do more, needed to do more, but what could he offer? His barn was filled with equipment and hay. The only structure large enough was the old cattle shelter at the edge of his property, and that was barely standing, walls riddled with gaps and roof half-caved. She spoke again in that language he couldn't understand but somehow did. He caught feelings more than words. She was apologizing for being too big, for being a burden, for existing in a space that wasn't built for her. Jacob shook his head fiercely. He pointed at her, then at his chest, then made a gesture that encompassed everything around them. She was welcome here. She belonged here. He'd make it work. Her eyes welled with something that looked like tears, but they evaporated before they could fall, turning to tiny sparkles of light that drifted away on the wind. He spent the next hour bringing out everything he could think of. Food, though he wasn't sure what she ate. Water in his largest bucket. More blankets. Pillows. A battery-powered lantern so she wouldn't be in complete darkness. She accepted each offering with a dignity that made him feel like he was presenting treasures to royalty. When he finally ran out of things to bring, he stood there awkwardly, not wanting to leave her alone but not knowing what else to do. The temperature was dropping fast. His breath came out in visible puffs. She was shivering. He could see it in the way her shoulders trembled, in how she pulled the blankets tighter. They weren't enough. He'd given her everything he had, and it wasn't enough. Frustration burned in his throat. He owned hundreds of acres, had money in the bank from good years of cattle sales, but none of it mattered because he couldn't protect this woman from the simple fact of a cold night. She looked at him, and he saw her making a decision. She stood up, letting the blankets fall away, and started walking toward the barn. Jacob followed, confusion mixing with concern. She stopped at the barn entrance, examining the wide doors that were tall enough for tractors but still several feet shorter than her. She'd have to crawl inside. The interior was dusty and dark, filled with shadows and the smell of old hay. It wasn't fit for anyone, let alone her. But before he could protest, she turned to him and asked the question that would become seared into his memory forever. She gestured to herself, to her dress of starlight, and mimed removing it. Then she pointed inside the barn and looked at him expectantly. The words that came from her lips were alien, but their meaning crashed into him with perfect clarity. Where should I undress? She was asking where she could prepare for the night, where she could shed whatever clothes she wore and try to find comfort in his inadequate shelter. Heat flooded Jacob's face. He hadn't thought about the implications, hadn't considered the intimacy of the situation. This woman, this impossible, beautiful being, was standing in front of him asking for privacy and guidance, and his mind had gone completely blank. But then something shifted inside him. He'd spent 20 years alone on this ranch, 20 years building walls around his heart because wanting something you couldn't have was a special kind of torture. Looking at her now, shivering in the cold, vulnerable and trusting, he felt those walls crumble. She'd fallen from the sky into his life, and maybe that meant something. Maybe after all these years of emptiness, the universe had finally answered a prayer he'd been too afraid to speak. He met her swirling eyes and made a choice that was either the bravest or most foolish thing he'd ever done. He pointed directly in front of himself. Right here. Right in front of me. He didn't look away, didn't shy from the moment. If she was going to be here, if they were going to navigate this impossible situation together, then they'd do it with honesty. No hiding, no shame, no pretending they were anything other than two lonely souls who'd found each other against all odds. She stared at him, understanding dawning across her features. Then slowly, carefully, she smiled. The world seemed to hold its breath. Jacob's heart thundered so loud he was certain she could hear it, even with the distance their sizes created between them. She studied his face, searching for something, and whatever she found must have satisfied her because she nodded once, slowly. Her hands moved to the fastenings of her garment, and Jacob realized with a start that what he thought was cloth was something else entirely. The starlight dress wasn't fabric at all. It was part of her, woven from her own energy, her own essence. As she released it, the light began to fold away, retreating into her skin like water being absorbed by sand. Underneath, she wore something more familiar, a simple undergarment that suggested her people, wherever they were, understood modesty even if their technology was beyond his comprehension. But more than that, as the starlight faded, he saw her truly for the first time. The luminescence of her skin grew brighter without the dress to contain it. The constellation markings he'd noticed before spread across her entire body, mapping patterns that told stories in a language written in light. She was magnificent. Not just beautiful, but powerful in a way that made him feel small yet strangely protected. She stood there, allowing him to see her, and he understood this was a gift. This was trust of the deepest kind. She was showing him who she really was, what she really was, without the covering that made her seem more like the people of his world. She spoke, and this time he caught his own name in the foreign words. Jacob. She'd learned it somehow, plucked it from his mind or the air between them. Then she placed her hand over her own heart and said a word that sounded like music. Lyra. Jacob repeated it, letting the syllables roll off his tongue. Lyra. Her smile widened, and the light from her markings pulsed brighter for just a moment, like a heartbeat made visible. She gestured for him to wait and carefully lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged in front of the barn. At this height, they were closer to equal, though she still towered over him. She patted the earth beside her, an invitation. Jacob sat, feeling grass soak the seat of his jeans with evening dew, and waited. Lyra began to speak, and though he still couldn't understand the words themselves, images began to form in his mind. He saw a place between stars, a realm that existed in the spaces where physics bent and broke. He saw a city built from light and sound, structures that sang themselves into existence. He saw people like her, giants made of starfire, living in harmony with forces that humans had only theorized about. He saw beauty beyond imagination. Then he saw war. Darkness spreading through that impossible city, a shadow that consumed light and left nothing behind. He saw Lyra running, saw her diving through a portal as her world crumbled. Saw her falling through the void between realities until she crashed into his field, into his life. She was a refugee. The last of her kind, perhaps, or at least one of the few who'd escaped. The weight of that crashed over Jacob like a physical force. She'd lost everything. Her home, her family, her entire civilization, all of it gone in the span of what he sensed were only hours. And she'd landed here, on his ranch, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the energy woven into her skin and the hope that wherever she ended up might offer sanctuary. Jacob felt tears burning his eyes. He understood loss. He'd lost his parents, lost the future he'd imagined, lost years to loneliness. But his losses were nothing compared to hers. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and placed his hand on her arm. His palm barely covered a small portion of her skin, but the contact sent warmth flooding through both of them. Her constellation marks flared bright, responding to his touch, and he felt something pass between them. Not words but something deeper. A connection that transcended language and size and even species. She was alone. He was alone. But together, maybe they could be less alone. Maybe they could build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. Lyra placed her enormous hand over his, engulfing it completely, and spoke a phrase that he didn't need translation to understand. Thank you. Thank you for not running. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for being here. Jacob blinked back tears and nodded. He didn't have the words to explain what he was feeling, didn't have the vocabulary for the way his chest felt too small to contain the emotions surging through him. So instead, he just stayed there, hand in her hand, sitting in the cold grass under a sky full of stars, and let the silence speak for both of them. The night deepened around them, but neither moved. Practical concerns would come later. Questions about how she'd survive, what she'd eat, where she'd truly sleep, all of that could wait. For now, there was only this moment, two beings from different worlds finding common ground in shared loneliness. Jacob looked up at her face, at the way starlight played across her features, and made a silent promise. He didn't know how, but he'd protect her. He'd give her a home. He'd make sure she never felt as lost as she did right now. Whatever it took, however long it took, he'd build a life that had room for both of them. Lyra seemed to sense his determination. She lifted his hand and pressed it gently against her forehead, a gesture that felt sacred. Her eyes closed, and he felt her emotions wash over him. Gratitude. Hope. Fear. And underneath it all, something that made his breath catch. Recognition. She'd felt it too, that moment when she first opened her eyes and saw him. The sense that somehow, impossibly, they were meant to find each other. That across the vast distances of space and reality, their paths had been drawn to intersect. Jacob didn't believe in fate. He believed in hard work and sweat and the things you could build with your own two hands. But standing here with this impossible woman, feeling her warmth and her pain, he was willing to reconsider everything he thought he knew. Dawn came too soon and not soon enough. Jacob woke with his back against the barn wall, Lyra's hand still resting near him like a protective barrier against the world. Sometime during the night, she'd curled around him, creating a living shelter that kept the worst of the cold away. His body ached from sleeping on hard ground, but he'd never felt more rested. There was something about her presence, something that settled the restless energy that usually plagued his sleep. When he stirred, she woke instantly, alert in the way of someone who'd learned to sleep with one eye open. Morning light transformed her. The constellation markings that had glowed in the darkness became subtle silver lines, beautiful but less otherworldly. She looked at him with an expression that mixed embarrassment and defiance, as if daring him to comment on their sleeping arrangement. Jacob just smiled and stood up, stretching muscles that protested the movement. They had work to do. He couldn't build her a proper house overnight, but he could make the barn livable. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. He started by clearing out the equipment, hauling tractors and plows into the open air where they'd have to weather the elements for now. Lyra watched for a few minutes, then began helping, moving machinery that would have taken him hours in a matter of minutes. She was careful despite her strength, setting each piece down gently, making sure nothing was damaged. Together, they transformed the barn from a storage space into something that resembled shelter. Jacob brought in clean hay, lots of it, creating a bed that could accommodate her size. He strung up tarps to block the gaps in the walls and nailed down loose boards in the roof. By midday, they'd created something that wouldn't win any awards but would at least keep her dry and relatively warm. Lyra examined their work with an expression that made Jacob's chest tight. She was trying not to cry. This rough barn, this hastily arranged pile of hay, meant everything to her because it was the first real shelter she'd had since her world ended. She knelt down and pulled Jacob into a hug that lifted him completely off his feet. He felt like a child in her arms, but instead of feeling diminished, he felt cherished. Protected. Wanted. Food became the next challenge. Jacob brought out everything he could think of, bread and fruit and vegetables, meat both cooked and raw, milk and cheese and eggs. Lyra examined each offering carefully, and he realized with a start that she was probably determining what was safe for her to eat. Whatever biology her species had, it might not align with Earth food. But to his relief, she selected an apple and bit into it carefully. Her face lit up with delight, and she devoured 3 more in rapid succession. Apparently, fruit was universal. Over the following days, they fell into a routine. Jacob would wake early and tend to his cattle, then spend the rest of the day working on improvements for Lyra's shelter. She, in turn, began helping around the ranch in ways he'd never imagined. She could move hay bales by the dozen, repair fence lines in minutes, and even help deliver a difficult calf birth with hands gentle despite their size. The cattle, after initial wariness, seemed to accept her presence. They'd graze near the barn, almost like they were keeping her company. But it wasn't just practical work that filled their days. Jacob brought out books, pointing at pictures and teaching her words. English came slowly to her, her mouth struggling to form sounds that her species had never needed. But she was determined, practicing constantly, until simple words became sentences. Jacob. Friend. Home. Safe. Each word she learned felt like a victory. In exchange, she taught him about her world, using the images she could project into his mind to show him wonders he'd never dreamed of. The hardest part was the isolation. They couldn't let anyone know she was here. Jacob's nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, but word traveled fast in rural communities. If anyone saw her, if anyone knew, they'd come. Government or military or scientists, someone would come and take her away. So they hid. Jacob made excuses when people called, claimed he was busy with a big project, deflected invitations to town. It meant lying to people he'd known his whole life, but the alternative was unthinkable. 6 weeks after her arrival, something changed. Jacob was repairing the barn roof while Lyra held the ladder steady when she suddenly froze. Her constellation marks blazed bright, responding to something he couldn't sense. She spoke urgently in her own language, and though he still didn't understand every word, fear was universal. He climbed down quickly, looking around for whatever threat had alarmed her. The sky was clear, the land empty, but she was staring toward the old stone circle where she'd first arrived. They ran together, Jacob on his horse and Lyra covering ground with enormous strides that ate up distance. When they reached the stones, Jacob saw what had frightened her. The air above the circle was splitting. Not like a tear in fabric but like reality itself was opening, creating a doorway to somewhere else. Lyra grabbed Jacob and pulled him back, shielding him with her body as light poured from the opening. Something was coming through. Someone was coming through. Jacob's hand went to the rifle on his saddle, though he had no idea if bullets would matter against whatever was arriving. A figure emerged, another giant, but this one was clearly male and covered in armor that looked like crystallized darkness. He saw Lyra and spoke words that needed no translation. He'd found her. Followed her across the void. And from the way Lyra tensed, from the terror in her eyes, Jacob understood with horrible clarity that this was what she'd been running from. This was the darkness that had destroyed her world. And now it had followed her to his. The armored giant laughed, a sound like mountains cracking, and reached for Lyra. Jacob raised his rifle, knowing it was useless, knowing he was about to die, but unable to stand by and do nothing. If this was the end, he'd face it protecting the woman he'd come to care for more than his own life. The first bullet ricocheted off the dark giant's armor with a sound like a bell cracking. He turned his attention to Jacob, and those eyes were empty voids that swallowed light. Lyra screamed, a sound that shattered the air itself, and threw herself between them. The dark giant's blow, meant for Jacob, caught her across the shoulder instead. She went down hard, and Jacob's world turned red. Without thinking, without caring about his own safety, he charged forward and fired again, aiming for the gaps in the armor, for anything vulnerable. The giant swatted at him like he was an insect, but Lyra recovered faster than expected. Her hands grabbed Jacob and tossed him clear, saving him from a strike that would have pulverized his bones. Then she was on her feet, facing the threat, and Jacob saw her transform. The constellation markings across her body blazed like stars going nova. Energy coalesced around her hands, forming weapons made of pure light. She'd been holding back, he realized. All this time, she'd been hiding what she truly was. Not just a refugee, but a warrior. The battle that followed was beyond anything Jacob could have imagined. They moved at speeds his eyes could barely track, light and darkness colliding with impacts that shook the earth. The stone circle beneath them began to glow, responding to the energy being thrown around. Jacob retreated to a safe distance, still clutching his useless rifle, watching helplessly as Lyra fought for both their lives. She was magnificent and terrifying, every movement precise, every strike devastating. But the dark giant was strong too, and worse, he seemed to be drawing power from somewhere else, growing stronger as the fight continued. Jacob realized the portal was still open. The dark giant was being reinforced by whatever lay on the other side. If they didn't close it, more would come through. Lyra was holding her own now, but against an army, she'd fall. They'd both fall. He looked at the stone circle, at the ancient rocks his grandfather had claimed were special, and made a connection. These stones were anchors. They'd brought Lyra here. Maybe they could close the door too. He ran toward the circle, ignoring Lyra's cry of warning, and placed his hands on the nearest stone. It was like grabbing a live wire. Energy surged through him, burning and freezing simultaneously. But underneath the pain, he felt something else. Recognition. These stones knew him. They'd been waiting, perhaps for generations, for someone with the will to use them. Jacob didn't understand the mechanics, didn't know the science or magic that made them work. He just knew what needed to happen. He thought about closing, about sealing, about protecting what was his. The stones responded. Light erupted from the circle, wrapping around the portal, constricting it like a muscle. The dark giant noticed immediately. He abandoned his fight with Lyra and charged toward Jacob, but she was faster. She tackled him from behind, wrapping her arms around his torso, holding him back. Jacob poured everything he had into the stones, feeling them drink his energy, his will, his desperation. The portal began to shrink. The dark giant realized what was happening and struggled harder, but Lyra held firm. She was screaming something at Jacob, words he didn't need to understand. She was saying goodbye. She was telling him to finish it. Even if it meant trapping her and the dark giant together on this side, even if it meant giving up any chance of going home, she wanted him to close the door. Jacob understood what she was asking. If he closed the portal now, she'd be stuck on Earth forever. No chance of finding other survivors. No chance of rebuilding her civilization. No chance of anything except a life hiding on his ranch, unable to show herself to the world. It was a prison sentence. But it was also survival. And more than that, it was a choice. She was choosing him over everything else she'd ever known. The weight of that decision crushed him and lifted him simultaneously. She was choosing this life, this world, him. But Jacob wasn't going to let her sacrifice everything. Through the pain of the energy flowing through him, he pushed harder at the stones, focusing not just on closing the portal but on moving something through it. The dark giant must have sensed his intent because his struggles became frantic. Lyra held on with everything she had, her constellation marks burning so bright that Jacob had to look away. With a roar that came from the depths of his soul, Jacob commanded the stones to do the impossible. Send them both back. Trap the dark giant in the void between worlds where he could never threaten anyone again. The portal exploded with light. The dark giant screamed as reality itself grabbed him and pulled. He tried to resist, tried to anchor himself to earth, but the stones were relentless. Lyra felt herself being pulled too and released her grip, pushing away, trying to stay on this side. But the portal's pull was too strong. She slid backward across the ground, leaving gouges in the earth. Her eyes locked with Jacob's, and in that moment, an entire conversation happened in silence. She was afraid. He was terrified. Neither of them wanted this. But the portal was closing, dragging her with it, and there was nothing either could do. Unless Jacob let go of the stones. Unless he stopped the closing and let the portal remain open. which would mean more dark giants could come through. Would mean putting Earth at risk for her sake. Lyra shook her head frantically, begging him with her eyes not to make that choice. Better to lose her than doom everyone. But Jacob looked at her, at this woman who'd become the center of his world in just 6 weeks, and knew he couldn't let her go. He'd spent 20 years alone. He wouldn't choose to return to that, not when he'd finally found something worth living for. He released one hand from the stones and reached toward her. The portal's pull lessened immediately, stabilizing. The dark giant, already half pulled into the void, was stuck between worlds, unable to move forward or back. Lyra stopped sliding. She looked at Jacob's outstretched hand, at the choice he was making, and tears finally fell from her eyes, diamond drops that sparkled as they hit the ground. She began crawling toward him, fighting against the pull, reaching for his hand with her own. The distance between them felt infinite. The portal wavered, unstable, threatening to collapse entirely or explode outward. Their fingers touched. Jacob's hand closed around one of her massive fingers, and the circuit completed. Energy flowed between them, human and giant, earth and stars. The stones responded to their combined will. The portal stabilized, then began to close properly, pulling the dark giant completely through while leaving Lyra firmly anchored to this side. He screamed as reality folded around him, erasing him from this dimension, trapping him in the space between spaces where nothing existed but void. Then the portal sealed with a thunderclap that echoed for miles, and silence fell. Jacob collapsed, completely drained. Lyra caught him before he hit the ground, cradling him against her chest like something precious. They lay there together in the ruined stone circle, two beings from different worlds who'd just rewritten the rules of what was possible. Jacob's consciousness faded, but before darkness claimed him, he felt her lips pressed gently against his forehead and heard her speak in perfect English, words she'd been practicing in secret. "I love you." 3 words he'd never expected to hear. 3 words that meant she was choosing to stay, choosing him, choosing this life. He wanted to respond, to say he loved her too, but exhaustion pulled him under. When he finally woke hours later, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in familiar colors, and Lyra was still holding him, still keeping him safe, still here. They had 1,000 challenges ahead. The world wouldn't understand. Their sizes would always be different. But none of that mattered because they'd survived, together, and that was enough.